Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and today it's just me talking about the last year of content here at the Afghanistan Project Podcast and what's to come in the new year. And I want to start by talking about where we are in terms of Afghanistan media coverage. You know, really, there is so much conflict and pain in the world right now that coverage of Afghanistan has really become very minimal. And at the same time, the suffering that is facing Afghans is probably at the highest that it has been since I began covering the conflict. And so it's very difficult right now for so many of us who want to see the media spotlight on this country that we left in such a devastating condition. And I want to talk about some of those recent developments and why they're concerning and why I think that we really need to keep an eye on Afghanistan. First, I want to talk about women. You know, we've seen the rights of women just stripped away bit by bit since the Taliban came to power and told us that they were going to protect women's rights within the context of Islam, and they have not protected anything about women. In fact, the only equality that women have in Afghanistan is the equality of punishment. The Taliban initially said that when women broke the laws, that the consequences would be meted out to their male family members. That has not been the case. Women have been jailed. Women have been beaten and tortured in jail. They have been raped in jail, killed in jail. They only face equality in Afghanistan in terms of consequences. So the last month has seen a marked increase of really problematic rulings against women. And it started in December 4th when the Taliban banned midwifery training and nursing training, banned women from attending those things. So this is really important. If you follow the conflict and under the first regime, you know that there were massively high maternal mortality rates under the prior Taliban regime, and there were high infant mortality rates as well. And we worked really hard to increase midwifery training, to increase the number of midwives available, to do whatever we could to bring those rates down. And we did. We halved them, I believe, in the course of 20 years. And now, in many provinces, Afghan women cannot see a male doctor. And so if there are not women being trained in nursing and midwifery that will save their lives and save the lives of a future of Afghans, a future generation of Afghans, that's a significant problem. And it should remind us of where we came from and how this all came to be. And, you know, there was some uproar, as there always is, when the Taliban strip women of just another right. But there was not nearly enough. So then we saw some calm for a little bit, and there were two decrees in very close proximity to one another. First, December 28th, when women were banned from their houses that are built in Afghanistan now cannot include windows that might look in on the kitchen and other areas that women use, because the ability to see a woman might cause a man to do something obscene. Now, the Taliban know all about this. I'm working on a piece on this right now, and I'm just like stealing my own lead. But the Taliban know all about the obscene acts that men are forced to do because they see a woman, because they're doing them. I can't tell you how many stories I have heard and or told of Taliban fighters raping women, stealing and kidnapping women, and subjecting them to sexual slavery. So, yeah, they do need to be protected against the Taliban, but removing windows is not the way to do that. Now, don't worry, in homes that already have these obscene windows, you can just build a wall. Yeah, build a wall so that nobody can see the women inside. Once again, little by little, rights and the things that women can enjoy are being taken away. The next day, the Taliban, and this is an echo of a previous ban, but said that women are no longer allowed to work for NGOs. They said this 2 Decembers ago. They said that anybody who offended was going to have their license removed, And now it looks like they're going to make good on their word. Now, when this was previously put in place, I think something like 18 NGOs said we're not working in Afghanistan anymore. So it'll be interesting to see what happens now. Everyone is no longer up in arms like they were before about Afghan women's rights, even though Afghan women have even fewer rights now than they did before. So I'm very interested to see what happens next. I want to mention the fact that also there was a rumor going around the internet that the Taliban had told Afghan men that they should keep their women off the internet. And that was really concerning to me, because I can't tell you how many women I chat with online or have chatted with over the last 3.5 years online. And that was their one place where they were allowed to access the world. So I asked Suhail Shaheen about it. And he told me that, Miss Beth Bailey, it's just rumors. So if you've listened to the podcast or followed me on social media, you know about how much weight I give those words. But that's what I've been told. And I will keep digging. And if I find proof, you will see it here or in any of the outlets I write for, or on my Substack, bwbailey85, .substack, whatever. You'll see that there first, because man, that would be a doozy. It might not seem really important, but it would be a doozy. The other thing that was interesting that happened in the last week is that the Pakistan carried out a strike against alleged TTP targets in Paktia province, and something like 46 women and children were killed, and the pictures made their way to the internet. People were very upset. Afghans were very upset. And this spawned border strikes from the Taliban into Pakistan. Something to watch for certain. There have been skirmishes or almost skirmishes before between the Taliban and other countries, but I'll be keeping an eye on that. And this is something I want to start doing either at the beginning or end of every episode, because it is really hard to get this news just in everyday coverage, because as I said before, there's so much pain in the world right now. There's so much going awry in the world right now. But if you are someone who has access to information that you want the world to hear, send it to the podcast email, the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com, or shoot me a message on any of the social media platforms I use. I am happy to spread the true word about what's happening in Afghanistan. And I want to do that through this podcast because it's a platform that I have. And to that end, I want to just talk about the year. There have been something like 40 episodes this year with just really amazing guests. I've had the whole gamut of people on here, from veterans talking about transition and the importance of transition assistance programming because either transition failed them or they had a relatively easy time because they had programming in place. That was an incredible episode. And then I've had some amazing Afghan thinkers like Pashtana Durrani, the founder of Learn Afghanistan, who is one of my heroes, talking about how she came up with the idea of bringing learning to girls in rural areas who didn't have access to school because the Taliban kept blowing their schools up. I've had great news on the podcast, like when Sean Van Diver and Andy Sullivan came on to talk about their work to get additional SIVs, which ended up bringing 12,000 more special immigrant visas to at the time, I think there were over 130,000 Afghans still in the pipeline. I've had Bo Lendman with Afghan Hire talking about the issues that his employees are having with SIV, but also his process of creating Afghan Hire and trying to bring hope and jobs to people who were not able to support themselves in the aftermath of the withdrawal. I've had charity workers. I've had Heather Barr at Human Rights Watch, who is absolutely a boss and so smart, and she's been on top of the Taliban's misogynistic rulings since day one. It was such an honor to have her here and talking about the importance of women's rights, not just in Afghanistan, but around the world, that the encroachment on women's rights by the Taliban is bad for women everywhere. She's spot on, and it was incredible. I've had some awesome veterans come in and talk about either their service or their advocacy. I have had John Andrasik come on and talk about his advocacy through song, Five for Fighting, for those of you who don't know. And I had the opportunity to watch John in person too. Just an incredible advocate, such a passionate performer, and he's made a world of difference through his music, and it was just an honor to sit with him. I have had brave Afghan women sitting in their country who used to be on a path to absolute greatness, talking about how they manage the day-to-day and what they hope can happen in the future. I've had repeat guests, people who I love to hear what they're doing. Leslie Merriman talking about her advocacy for rape victims. John Moses coming on. My gosh, how many times did John Moses come on this year? Never enough is the answer. Same thing with Will Selber and Kate Kavarovic. Never enough times. There are people now who aren't just guests, they're friends. Some of whom I got to meet up with in DC this summer, and just, again, not just guests, but friends. It has just been an incredible, incredible year of learning from people who gave up everything, like Gita Bakshi, who started FOML. That was one of the more recent episodes. And, people like Lynn O'Donnell. Lynn, actually, I want to talk a little bit about my story here. And Lynn, for me, is deeply tied to my own story of covering Afghanistan and what it's meant to me, because I came across Lynn's journalism probably during the fall, but the next time that I saw her was when she was tweeting, when the Taliban had her in custody. Nobody knew that at the time, but she was tweeting these things that were totally nonsensical. And I had just reported on the Taliban's practice of bachabazi, which was something that the international community, when the Taliban took power, said, well, at least they don't do that. And bachabazi, for those who don't know, is boy play. Men will take a younger boy, dress him up like a girl, and have him dance at functions, and then use him as a sex object at the end of the night. It's a terrible practice, and the Taliban had outlawed it during their first regime. And so people said, well, thank God, at least that won't be allowed. It was like the one good thing people thought was going to happen when the Taliban took power. But I had a ton of sources who were sending me video and photographs that, no, not, in fact, that's still going on. And I broke that story with another evac volunteer. And I remember thinking, this is not going to be good for me. And then there was Lynn O'Donnell. And it came out the next day that she was being incredibly courageous, had been arrested by the Taliban for daring to tell the truth about what they were doing when they were rolling through the country during the withdrawal. And it was not 2 days later that my life, as I knew it, exploded. And I began the quick descent into divorce. And so that whole time frame, big truth-telling moment here, but it's Lynn's story was so needed at that time, and I had no idea. She's just a phenomenal woman, fearless, and I like to think that those are the people I learn from, and the people who've taught me how to be courageous in this crazy journey of covering Afghanistan and doing the podcast. So having Lynn on was more special than anyone can possibly know. But that's the backstory of why that was so important. And I'm going to be resharing that episode because I think that, I don't know if it was timing or what, but Lynn has seen more of the conflict than anyone I know. And if you listen to one episode from this year, again, I urge you to have it be Lynn's episode. She is just an indomitable force for good. But yeah, there were just so many people, listening to Elizabeth Lynn and Terry Samula talk about reunification cases, and listening to Ashraf Haidari, the Afghan ambassador, come on and talk about what failed in the previous government and what needs to be done now. Just so many incredible voices. Gabby Southern Dice talking about what it was like to be on the female search teams, FSTs, not FETs. That was an important distinction. But at HKIA, my gosh, earth-shattering things. So, and I know I haven't gotten everybody. I have this all down on a list, and there's just no way to name everyone without boring you all to tears. But every single episode this last year has been important to me, and here's why it's important to me. Before Afghanistan fell, I had been completely, and this is where my own story comes in that I've never really shared here on the podcast, but I had been outside of the world of current events in Afghanistan for a good 8 years. It was in June of 2013 that I made the full severance between myself and that country, because I had just left my job in intelligence. I was very upset that the Taliban, that we were having negotiations with the Taliban, that we had opened our office, or their office, in Qatar. And in June, they raised their flag over it and basically said, hey, look, we're here. We're a government in exile, and we're here to negotiate. And I took that personally. I was very angry that my anger was very impotent. I was a housewife, far away from the place where I used to work, far away from the contacts I used to have. And so I had no way to do anything about this. And so I decided, rather than just be massively angry every day, I would not look at Afghanistan again. And I knew this when I left, but long before they raised their flag, that when our conflict ended, it would go badly. No matter who was in charge, I knew it would go badly. And it was just a question of how badly. And unfortunately, the answer to that was terribly badly. And I just want to chat briefly about how I got into the withdrawal and how I got into Afghanistan. When I decided to study Afghanistan, it wasn't really a decision. I've talked about this on other people's podcasts. It was kind of a God moment for me. I can't explain it. I don't know why Afghanistan, of all countries, drew me in the way that it did, but it did. And it became a passion, and it became something that I just wanted to make a difference there. And I knew that it was a massively complicated country that was going to require a lot of thinking and dynamic solutions. And I considered it kind of a lost cause when we started those negotiations with the Taliban. Even though those ended, it felt like we were just always hanging on and not really trying to fight to make the country successful, but just kind of hanging on until we could finally let go. And when that happened, I was not paying attention to anything that was going on inside Afghanistan. It was the spring of 2021. What got me in was watching Tom Schumann putting out a message on Instagram saying, "Can somebody help me with Zach?" his interpreter who was with him in Sangin. And I knew Tom because I had written about his work with Patrol Base Abate. And I knew about Abate because when I got really angry about the Taliban raising their flag over their office, I went back in time. I didn't give up on Afghanistan. I just gave up on present day Afghanistan because there was nothing I could do about it. So I went back to the past. I started writing a novel it was set during the surge, and it was a love story between a young congressional staffer and a new Marine officer who was in the middle of infantry officer course in Quantico. And I decided that Marine was going to get put with 3-5. And if you know anything about the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment in Sangin in 2010, you know that they had an exceedingly hard deployment. The story of 3-5 in Sangin really resonated with me. Tom was such a vocal advocate for the men of 3-5, for the families of the fallen, the memories of the fallen. And so when he was in pain, which he clearly was, over Zach's future, I had to stand up and do something. I couldn't just sit there, even though I didn't want to have anything to do with what was taking place in Afghanistan. And so I said, hey, I'll tell the story, if I can. And I got a yes, and I told the story, and I never stopped telling stories after that. It was slow at first, other people coming to me about their interpreters. And then it was an utter deluge. Just as soon as I got in touch with the evacuation groups that were still supporting our Afghan allies who were left on the ground in the aftermath of our initial evacuation, it was just every day inundated with messages from Afghans who were stuck in the SIV program, who got a P1 or P2 referral to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, who had applied for HP, who were under severe threat and didn't have access to any of that programming. And it became triaging. What do you need? What do you need? What do you need? Oh, these 15 people all have the same story. How can I tell those stories? And that was my life. I had no free time anymore. I was completely and totally obsessed with getting those stories out. It was an intense time. It is the most important thing I've done in my writing career. And it led to all of this. It led to the podcast. It led to me meeting Michael Cook and him saying, gosh, you should start a podcast. And I said, who the heck wants to listen to me? Like, are you kidding? You should start a podcast. You're writing a book. People want to listen to you. And I came to him with 2 pieces of paper. On one side, actually it was 1 piece of paper. On one side, I had all the names, all the people I wanted us to interview. And on the other side, I had the names of all the Afghans who had told me their stories, whose stories were incredibly compelling. And I wanted to make sure I told him that every episode had the story of an Afghan ally. Because this podcast needed to include Afghan voices of the people who were hurt by this withdrawal. And we agreed, we set about it, we started this, and even when I had to move on and cover other things, even as all of those things were happening, I still had a way to keep Afghanistan in people's minds through this podcast. So it has been an incredibly rewarding time, and I appreciate every single person who has listened to an episode, because it's validation for the voices that need to be listened to, and it's validation that this passion project has purpose too. I really think that I don't bring up these stories just because, the stories of that I brought up in the beginning about what's happening in Afghanistan today for nothing. We are very much looking at a return to pre-9/11 conditions in Afghanistan, and I've written about it before, that I think we're there. Terror groups are operational in the country. You've got camps everywhere. You have Al-Qaeda leaders saying, come to Afghanistan, it's the place to be. They are doing it right. They are not doing it right. That is not where we want Al-Qaeda to be sending its people to be trained. You have ISIS-K operational inside the country too. This is intensely problematic, and I know that many of the people listening to this right now will agree with me that there will be a reckoning in the future when people realize they should not have taken their eye off the ball of Afghanistan. And it's more than that. It's not just the terror threat, it's the people. It's the people who we said, if you support us, we'll make sure you're safe. And they supported us, and now they're getting killed and picked off. The reprisal campaign that started in August of 2020, before August of 2021. The reprisal campaign that has been ongoing for decades has not stopped. So, this is a very important, very dynamic situation, and I just appreciate all of you for giving me and for giving my guests your time. It means the world to me, and I'd love to hear from all of you about what you want to hear more of. If it were up to me, I would do more of what happened this year. Some veterans talking about their deployments, because I think that's incredibly important to understand why veterans care so deeply about Afghanistan. You really have to go back and understand what they did when they fought. And then I want to hear more refugee stories from people. For a long time in my coverage, I didn't look at any of the things Afghans were going through at the processing way stations. And there were some issues there, big time. And I didn't look at refugee issues at home because in my mind, I thought it can't be nearly as bad as what Afghans inside the country are going through. And I was wrong. There are many issues that refugees are facing, and I've tried to make sure that I'm highlighting those in the podcast and that I'm not giving only one side of the pain that has happened to Afghans at home and in the diaspora. So I'd love to have more refugee stories. I want to do more content for veterans just in general, like the transition episode that I had some incredible people on for last year. And, just all of the advocates who give great updates on ongoing issues with the Special Immigrant Visa Program or with the Priority 1 and Priority 2 programs in the U.S. RAP or with humanitarian parole. I love those things. I loved having Brent Hoffman came on last year and talked about his work documenting Mezainak, the copper mine, the area around the copper mine that the Chinese are now mining copper in. I believe they've started that process now. But he talked about the preservation efforts that the archaeologists were going through to try to keep this beautiful history alive as, mining towns grew up to the side. Just, there are so many unique and interesting aspects of what's going on and what has gone on in Afghanistan. So if you have a story that you want to share, if you know of somebody who has a story that you'd like to hear more about, I want to know about it. I really just want to keep telling stories about Afghanistan. And my final note is going to be completely pithy and ridiculous, but I have admirers, and I'm saying that very facetiously, but one of them on LinkedIn the other week said something about how I make a modest income in skin products with this podcast. I don't make any income off of this podcast. I haven't. But if you know of any skincare lines, and I took this to Twitter and made sure that I tagged all of my favorite skincare lines because, yes, I do enjoy. I think he said eye blushers, which, that's not a thing, sir. You need to educate yourself. But I do enjoy skincare products. And I think that it's a great tie-in, right? Afghan women don't get to go to beauty salons. They're not allowed because the Taliban closed them all. And they don't get to go to domestic violence shelters because those don't exist anymore thanks to the Taliban. And all of the divorces that were granted to them under the prior regime, those have all been vacated by the Taliban. And so there are a lot of women's issues that are really important in that country. And all these fantastic makeup brands who make a killing off of women who want to be able to look a certain way. That'd be a great advertising opportunity. Get this to more audiences. I don't need your products. I mean, I'd be happy to take them, trust me. But if you want to help advertise the Afghanistan Project Podcast and bring more Afghan women content to the forefront, I'm very much open to that idea. All jokes aside now, all pithy remarks aside, I just want to say again, anyone who's been here for even one episode of the last 2 years of content, you are very appreciated. And I just want to know what you want to hear, because you're the reason I keep doing this. So for now, Tasha Kaur, and hope to see you again soon.